Welcome, everyone. Glad you could join us on, at least in Halifax, this very wonderful, sunny, bright day. Our topic is going to diminish that brightness somewhat, I think, but also give us grounds for hope. I'd like to get to that in just a minute, but first, I'd like to welcome you all here with us today, and thank you for joining us. This is one of a series of public lectures that SCANS offers, and we will be sending you notice of more coming up in the future. I'd like to take a moment to introduce our panelists and our topic. So we're going to discuss the issue of poverty is a political choice. And we're going to take a look at the connection between the current economic crisis and government policies and the action needed to eliminate poverty in our province. So very important discussion and a very timely one. And I'd like to thank both Jackie and Alec for joining us and giving us their time. Jackie Barkley is a community activist who has worked in frontline social work and therapy for over 40 years, including at the Nova Scotia Hospital and the IWK. She's a founding member of numerous organizations, including the Metro Coalition for a Non-Racist Society. Jackie has lectured widely and written on issues of racism and white supremacy, parenting, and child protection. In 2014, she was the winner of the Ron Stratford Award for Outstanding Contribution to Social Service in Nova Scotia. With Jackie today is Alec Stratford, the Executive Director of the Nova Scotia College of Social Workers. He has worked as a child protection worker in Newfoundland, a school support counselor in Calgary, a community organizer with the City of Edmonton, and as a sessional instructor at MacEwan and Dalhousie Universities. Alec believes that engaged, informed, and mobilized communities can lead to transformative change. And that is at the heart of our talk today. So I'd like to welcome Jackie and Alec, and I will hand the Zoom reins over to you both. As a small housekeeping item before I do that, we will be taking questions after our presenters have had an opportunity to speak, and we would ask that you use your chat function down at the bottom of your Zoom screen. Thank you. Jackie, Alec?
Thank you, Donna Lee. Very impressed with all the technology that this organization has. It's really quite brilliant. So we're speaking clearly and correctly. Just want to check that. All right. So thank you for inviting us, first of all. And I wanted to make on behalf of Alec and I, a brief land acknowledgement. I think land acknowledgements are really important, but we need to start to appreciate that they can also wander into tokenism. So we are on the land of the Mi'kmaq, unceded and unsurrendered. We are all treaty people, and what that actually means is that we are responsible for the peace and friendship treaties. Very briefly, a land acknowledgement has no meaning if we have no intention to challenge the colonial infrastructure that we live under and the impact of colonialism on the Mi'kmaq people where we live. So I wanted to suggest two very practical things. The first, if you're politically inclined, is to go online and start looking up the land back movement and consider supporting the call of Indigenous people all across Canada and the United States on issues of land back, which I don't think means most white people's backyards, but it is an important political question about land being the core of the colonial venture in Canada. The second thing I would like to suggest for people who are volunteer oriented, which is also extremely important, is that this summer, Halifax is hosting the North American Indigenous Games. They will be taking place right here, and they need hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of volunteers. It's an opportunity for people to get both cultural education, which is given to the volunteer people and an opportunity to work side by side in trying to make the games a really important expression of Indigenous culture all across North America. It's NAIG. You can click it on and you can volunteer and you can go and start your training right away. So if we're serious about our participation in an anti-colonial process, we need to actually engage in it. So thank you.
Great. I'm going to start us off with some of our content here. So we'll shoot some slides up and we'll get cracking from there. So as we were introduced, we're here today to talk about poverty and its many intersections in our society. But fundamentally, what we want to make clear is that poverty isn't some natural phenomenon that's happened in our world or our society. It isn't the product of folks not working hard enough or folks not being able to care for themselves. We have made deliberate and intentional political choices in our society that have allowed poverty to flourish in many ways. Not only is that a moral issue that we must face, also it's a fiscally reckless one. When we leave poverty to fester as we have, it has repercussions throughout many of our systems across our society, whether that be emergency room visits, the classroom in terms of kids going to school hungry, whether it be low wages and precarious work. Again, our entire economic system is rooted around being able to exploit cheap labor for the ability of profits, and holding on to a low minimum wage supports that. Or to one of the areas that we are going to intersect with today, which is child welfare. And child poverty has had dire impacts on the delivery of child welfare services, and of course throughout our history has led way to some of the largest atrocities, certainly in Canadian history, through the residential school system on to the 60s scoop to the millennial scoop, as well as again the in Nova Scotia particularly, the anti-Black racism that has existed within the child welfare system, leading to the creation of the Home for Colored Children, and horrific abuses that occurred there. Our inability to be able to connect poverty and child welfare has continued to this day to lead to increasing challenges, an erosion of the profession of social work to be able to deliver this services in a meaningful way, and most importantly has really impacted the rights of children and families. These are, again, some of the areas that we're going to dive into today, and we don't want to leave you with just despair, because ultimately that is not where we are and where we ought to be. We can create change in our society. We have, in fact. And so we hope to leave you today with a set of actions that inspire all of you to make some meaningful change in areas that you can. So we plan to be about an hour and a half. That includes questions today. We are going to try and take a break somewhere through, and we do hope that this session is educational and enlightening as we walk through. So I just wanted to going the wrong way. There we go. Jackie's going to just talk briefly about the organization that we are here representing today.
All right. Thank you, Alex. So CWAC that you can see up there is the Child Welfare Advocacy Coalition. And the Child Welfare Advocacy Coalition is an example of fighting against despair. So about 6 years ago, 7 years ago, the provincial government, 2017, 2018, started a process, 2016 actually, started a process of trying to rewrite the Nova Scotia child welfare legislation with the ostensible intention of improving it. And of course, as governments are wont to do right now, they decided that they wanted to do consultation. And they actually started doing the consultation in the summer, which, as we all know in Nova Scotia, is where you go for consultation when you actually don't want to hear anybody's opinion. Anyway, I remember going to some of the consultations where there were 3 of us in a room. The information was not well circulated. I think many of us involved in the child welfare system experienced it as pretty token. What that meant, however, was that when the legislation was finally passed, it was passed without taking into account a lot of the fears, criticisms, and concerns that frontline child welfare persons, social workers, people in the legal aid system, lawyers, all of whom had numerous criticisms. So in 2017, a group of therapists involved in the delivery of service to child protection clients wrote an open letter to the minister outlining our concerns with what was happening with the new legislation. That list was pretty extensive. And just as an example, it included the fact that it was likely the new legislation was going to create increased numbers of referrals. It was likely that the new legislation was reflecting an increased fear of risk, so that the kinds of things that professionals were being asked to make reports of, many of us felt were not, in fact, the kind of issues that really have to do with abuse and neglect, and more have to do with issues of risk and issues that did not involve being able to strengthen families, though that's certainly the language. The second thing that we had seen already is that the new legislation had created enormous problems with the availability of services. I won't go into some of the technical details of why the legislative changes resulted in this, but what essentially happened is that the volume of child protection referrals, the volume of work individual caseworkers was being asked to do went up. The volume of the number of people requiring the support and intervention of legal aid also went up, and the resources did not go up. So that's just that's a perfect storm waiting to happen. On a very concrete level, I want to tell you a story about what was going on then, which inspired me and a lot of my colleagues, certainly not me alone. But this story was a family I was working with at the time it was a large blended family. There were 8 children, and one of the children was having significant difficulties. The family asked for child protection support. The child was removed from the home. The child tax benefit was removed, and which is a significant amount of money that is essentially a federal transfer payment directly to families, if I'm describing it correctly, which has a huge impact on low-income people, disproportionate. So the amount of money that the federal government gives is disproportionately important when your income goes down. So when the child was returned to this family, it took 5 months before the child tax credit was returned to this family, during which time the father in this family had to sell all of his tools in order to get enough money for the children to have what they needed to go back to school. Having had to sell all his tools, of course, it was not possible for him to do the kind of work that he'd been doing to bring in the money, et cetera, et cetera. You see where this picture is going. So many of us started to advocate for changes in the policy around the child tax benefit and its impact on low-income families. And that started a process of creating this coalition. And it started the process of directly advocating with government, sometimes with petitions, sometimes on the street, sometimes, of course, it was during COVID, which made things difficult after 2020. But there were a whole range of interventions that we were making. And at various points, there were probably 50 or 60 people who were involved in trying to advocate. What's important to know here is that there isn't anything worse than having your children removed from the state by the state. There's kind of nothing worse that can happen to you. And when your child is removed, even if it's for legitimate reasons requiring short-term resolution of serious family problems, the reality is that you're not in a position to talk back. So if something's happening in the school system, you can challenge the vice principal and the teacher about what's happening to your child. If something is happening in the healthcare system, you can try to challenge what's happening. But if your child is in care of the state, your capacity to speak up as a citizen about your opinions about how the situation is being handled basically doesn't exist. So the coalition was an important speaking on behalf of, which can be very paternalistic, but we were trying to speak on behalf of people who absolutely don't have the power to talk back. So I'll leave it there for now, Alec.
Okay, so again, the coalition's work has again been focused on a number of areas. Went the wrong way, sorry. One of them particularly has been that intersection between our social safety net, the goals of the goals of the province. It has a mandate to be able to provide, again, an adequate living and provide social services that keep people afloat, and where it intersects with child welfare. Well, one of the, again, numbers that consistently come up is the Child and Family Report Card produced by the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives, which does a measurement of poverty every year, diving deep into tax filer data that's filed with Canada Revenue Agency. Really gives them a detailed picture and look of what child poverty is looking like. And so it is a very credible study that has really demonstrated that since 1989, and 1989 is an important year, because that was the year when the Parliament of Canada, every member, stood up and voted for a motion to eliminate child poverty by the year 2000. Of course, we are missing their deadline by 22 years at this point in time. Nova Scotia has one of the worst track records in alleviating child poverty. It is particularly stubborn, and it is particularly deep in Nova Scotia. There's lots of reasons for that, which we'll go into. But at the end of the day, the real challenge is that we have, again, 1 in 4 children living in poverty. That represents almost 41,000 children. And of course, from that, our initiatives to be able to get us where we need to go have been really fundamentally flawed in getting there. Now, of course, we talk about child poverty, but let's be clear, there is no such thing as child poverty. There's just poverty. A child lives in a family. A family has adults attached to it or some kind of caregivers. Caregivers are attached to a broader community and to a society. So although we are talking about child poverty as a way to connect some of these points and hopefully inspire and motivate action, situating a strategy or even action solely on child poverty is not a winnable solution, as poverty is far more complex than that. But the numbers certainly show a striking picture, and one that we ought to be very concerned about. We can even dive deeper, and the CCPA does this for us as well, where we see what probably isn't a shock to folks based on our histories of anti-Black racism and colonialism, as well as sexism. But poverty is particularly racialized and gendered in Nova Scotia. So again, Black children in Nova Scotia face high poverty rates. 40% live in families that experience poverty. For Indigenous children, it's higher, 60%. And those are of Indigenous families who live on reserve, experience poverty. Again, folks living in poverty, what is also a striking, or should be a striking number, is that more than 1 in 2 children living in lone parent families live in poverty, 53%. Those lone parent families are generally run by women. It shows, again, the values that we've placed in society, in various services, and in people across the board. So I want to take some time speaking from this macro level, and we will bring this back down to what it looks like on the ground. Talk about how those numbers have come to be. And as I mentioned in the beginning, it has been a deliberate choice of all of us in many ways to allow for this to happen and to fester. Now, I'm not going to go all the way back to the beginning of our creation, wherever that begins for folks, but I do want to start a little bit on the 21st century and 20th century and where we landed. Certainly, after the Industrial Revolution started to take fold, we saw many people who were working and living on the land start to move into the industrial cities and be forced to work at extraordinarily long levels, incredibly exploitive for zero wages. And capitalism started to flourish in that environment. It found a way to continually exploit wealth, exploit land, exploit people to empower a few people. Throughout that 21st century, we started to respond in various ways. Social work as a profession came out of that. Social work and capitalism are married in many ways, is that one wouldn't exist without the other. Which creates lots of complexities for the profession, but that's another talk altogether. Where we landed with poverty is that for the longest time, again, in this attitude that kind of prevailed, came out of the idea that people who are poor are somehow deserving of that. That they've ended up on the streets through choices of their own. Our initial response was often through churches and through different parishes to provide charity, raising money, trying to alleviate some of that suffering. Of course, we went through the Great Depression, where we saw a massive amount of wealth grow at the top. That bubble burst, leaving people quite desperate on the other side. And what we started to see, particularly going into World War II and then on the outer side of that, is that governments ought to be playing a central role as our collective voice in transforming our policies, our society, so that folks can live a better life and have greater well-being. The New Deal in the States is a great example of this, where FDR started to spend billions of dollars on investing in infrastructure, in people, and in the beginning phases of our social safety net. In Canada, after World War II in particular, we saw the creation of the Marsh Report, which generated a whole slew of social programs that really did quite enormous things at, first of all, transitioning us from a post-war economy into, again, our more modern welfare state, putting things in place like public pensions, public housing, recognizing that when government spends money on people, it takes the burden and takes the costs away from people so that they can enrich their lives and move forward. Now, of course, throughout this time, we had the labor movement that was active and building at the same point in time. But we intentionally, at that point in time, did not bring in the real pain and strife of groups such as Indigenous folks, Black folks, women in particular, were left out of all of that rapid expansion and movement. And again, we started to see other calls and other social movements form around that. All of this, again, led to a call for more investments, more government services, leading us into around the 70s and 80s, where particularly the rich at the time were starting to organize, were starting to feel that they could create, again, a system that benefited them more. And with the support and the writings of folks like Milton Friedman, who argued against government investments in Keynesian economics, as it were, and devoted us back to the power of the free market, the power of, again, capitalists to be able to solve all of our problems, were the political choices that we started to make. It's the onset of neoliberalism that we still hold today. What this paradigm has done and what it's held, particularly in our modern day society, is that the individual is responsible for things like social risks, their own disability, housing, and that the state should have minimal intervention, and that fiscal policy should resemble austerity, not investing in government programs or government services, clawing it way back so that we could keep taxes low. And ultimately, this is where we saw the onslaught and the really dominance of trickle-down economics, which was touted by folks like Margaret Thatcher, Ronald Reagan, and Brian Mulroney here in Canada. What that ideology, again, is rooted in is the idea that if the wealthy gain more and more wealth and have more and more political power, that will somehow trickle down to benefit everyone else. Now, it's never trickled down. That's been debunked many times now by people who are far smarter and much better researchers than I am. And it doesn't trickle down because there are too many sponges at the top. And it's a broken philosophy that has never worked. However, what that has meant in terms of the flight of poverty and the stagnation that we saw in those numbers is that we've continued to make political choices that have valued and prioritized the free market as a solution to all of our problems. That again, that taxation and budgets should remain low in order for, again, that wealth to accumulate. And that ultimately the narrative is that you are on your own. Is the one that has come out of this the strongest. And this has, of course, created lots and lots of different challenges. And after 40 years, particularly of austerity, I would say that, our cost of living crisis, the crisis we're seeing with housing, and I'll come back to that one, our food systems, our child welfare systems, our education. I mean, we are in this situation in healthcare because of these same principles have all come back to this very broken ideology and theory at this point in time. And that what's sustained that theory as well is not just, again, corporate elites being able to lobby for policies that benefit them, but there's also this myth that I think many Canadians hold still to this day. And that's the American Canadian dream. I put them together. I think we know it as the American dream more closely, but I don't think it stems that much farther from the Canadian dream. The idea that if you work hard and apply yourself, that you will succeed. That is a myth at this point in time. We have one of the most educated populations we've ever had. We've got, again, one of the most productive economies we've ever had, yet the plight of folks in the middle income range is becoming one that's similar to those who have lived in poverty, where the ability to afford housing, the ability to afford food, the ability to simply go out and be with people is increasingly challenged because of the current political environment we are in, because we've allowed, again, for these choices to occur. Now, that Canadian dream, again, fuels much of our policy and political motivation. My good friend Christine Saunier often talks about how we've created a society and we've created a system where everyone believes that they can be a millionaire. And everyone believes that, again, we can earn more and more money to enrich ourselves. The reality is, and statistically proven, that every single one of us is closer to poverty than we ever are to being a millionaire. The reality is that you and I are one injury away from living in poverty a lot of the time. Yet we have not built any of our political system structures or made any choices based on that notion, that any one of us, just like that, could find themselves living below the poverty line. Our social safety net is non-existent, as it were. Jackie and I can tell you, again, the lengths that it goes through to even try and find somebody basic needs like housing at this moment in time, or food at this moment in time. There's nothing out there that is keeping folks in a quality of life. Even our income assistance levels, and this is one of the biggest atrocities, I think, of our of these political choices, is that right now, if I'm living in deep poverty and drawing on income assistance, I am $10,000 short a year of that poverty line. That's not even close to where we ought to be in terms of folks being able to enrich themselves, live a quality life, even improve their situation. Poverty is such that when you are living in such that deep level of despair, that deep level of never feeling like you're going to get a break, your ability to change that environment, your political power is so weakened and so little that it just keeps you in that place. And again, we can't rely on individuals to be able to move themselves out of poverty because when we're up against such power, it has to be a collective effort. Jackie, did you want to jump in on any of that?
So I guess I wanted to, I wish I could see everybody in this talk. I really wish I could see you, except for the people here who are helping us out. So I'm going to assume, because it scans, that a lot of you are in your 60s and 70s. I am 75 years old. My generational location, class location, racial location is very specific, and perhaps, but I can't see you, similar to a lot of you on this educational session. So I just want to bring down to earth, which is not to suggest the stats aren't important. I want to bring down to earth to how this actually works on an everyday level, and how many of us in this session are more like me than the people we're talking about, which doesn't mean, as Alex said, that as senior citizens, many of us wouldn't be close to poverty very quickly, that there aren't many senior citizens who aren't in poverty. It's not what I'm trying to say. I'm trying to talk about how race, colonization, and gender are actually acted out in creating poverty. So I'll deal with race first. Intergenerational wealth is a really important way for people to actually stay in what is referred to as the middle class, but maybe the stable working class. So intergenerational wealth is really important. And I'm willing to bet that a lot of us in this group today have houses that were bought that are now worth what Alec's family could not afford to buy, or our children could not afford to buy, and our grandchildren could definitely not afford to buy. The reality here, though, is that for African Nova Scotians, the question of intergenerational wealth has been a systemic and organized problem. So when my own mom passed away, she had been a bank teller, was making buckets of money, but she and my dad had been in that place in the post-war era where there were these social programs that Alec is talking about, and the access to housing for people with more average incomes was much easier after the war. So when my mom died, she didn't own a whole lot, but she owned the place she lived in. And the money from the place she owned that she had lived in her whole life went to me, her daughter. And when I got this money, I was in a bit of a state of shock because it seemed to me like the $1 million. It wasn't, but it seemed to me like it. So I was talking to some good friends of mine, women that I worked with in the African Nova Scotian community. I said, oh, so worried about all this money. It's going to change me, and blah, blah, blah. And she said, well, we don't understand what you're talking about. It sounds absolutely ridiculous that you would worry about having this money. And I said, oh, no. You'll understand this when your parents die. And my friend said, you must be joking. When my parents die, we will be lucky to collect among the siblings enough money to pay for the funeral. Because Black land in Black communities, if Black people still owned it, had nothing like the value of a house, even in Fairview, or a house in the South End, or now the houses in the North End. That's just a really important thing to know, that the experience that many of us have is not the experience that other groups of people have had, and that is structural. So that's why, for example, some of the politics around trying to identify land title in the Princeton townships has been an initiative that is extremely important, because people didn't even have title to their own land. So that's an example. That's an example of intergenerational wealth. So my mom and dad, just by owning a house, had money that could help me to own a house and money that could help me to go to university. That is not money that has been accessible to African Nova Scotian people for the last 7 generations. Important thing to realize. Secondly, Africville is an example. So instead of Africville, which is on a beautiful piece of land on the Bedford Basin that supports the McKay Bridge, people were given virtually nothing for their homes. Everyone has heard that their belongings were taken away in garbage trucks, and people were placed in public housing. Now, social housing, public housing is a really important thing, but the Black community in Africville actually had homes and land, which has never been recognized by the city of Halifax. So even though everybody says like city of Halifax has done really well by the people of Africville, the reality is that this beautiful park should actually be returned to the Black community, with plots of land sold for people to have land on the Bedford Basin. Just an idea. Gentrification. For any of you who live around or near the north end of Halifax, you will not have missed seeing the extraordinary growth of the value of land and the homes in the north end of Halifax, which is an historically white working class and Black community. Many of the people, of the small number of Black people who were able to own their own homes in the north end of Halifax, were unable to keep their homes when a whole lot of economic forces started happening in the 80s and 90s. And the value of their homes went down. They were essentially pushed out into suburban areas, and the land that their parents lived on, they cannot afford to return to in structured whole Black communities. This is a really important thing to remember. So gentrification has created situations where intact Black communities have essentially been destroyed and are now replaced by younger, mainly white people with professional and well-paid professional jobs. Colonialism, what does that actually look like as it has affected the poverty of people? Well, the residential, I'm going to assume that a lot of people have heard of or understand through the Truth and Reconciliation Commission the impact of residential schools. What is hard to grasp is the brutality of that process, in which the state, not even early on in a child protection system, but the state actually took away all of whole generations, at least 2 generations of Indigenous children. They were removed from the social relationships to their own families and their own grandparents and their own great-grandparents. That the whole process of building family and building relationships of love and health was broken when the children were simply removed, leaving whole communities devastated and emptied of the sound of children and their families. It's hard for us to grasp the meaning of that and what that has done to the mental health and emotional health of Indigenous communities. Another small example would be, some of you will remember in 2020, 2021, September, COVID has distorted my sense of time, but you remember that in the communities, the Acadian communities, southwest of of Wolfville and Kentville, is where there was huge controversy around who controlled fishing and who controlled lobster fishing. Help me out, Alec. Was that in September 2020 or 2021?
It's one of those years.
It's one of those years. Extremely important.
Yeah,
period.
but it was an intersection of the pandemic, coupled with Indigenous rights, coupled with racism. Yeah.
So what we have here, the situation in Nova Scotia, where fishing was a major part of how Mi'kmaq people on their own land over thousands of years, fishing was an active livelihood for Mi'kmaq people. And during the period up until very recently, in fact, until the Marshall decision, until Donald Marshall went out and fished and established very clearly through his Supreme Court appeal that Mi'kmaq people had the right to fish, the entire infrastructure of how we have set up the fishing system in Nova Scotia validates the rights of settlers without validating the rights of Indigenous people. I don't think that Indigenous people want to go out and destroy the livelihood of white fishers in Nova Scotia. But I think Indigenous fishers want the right for their own families to have the benefits of the fishery in Nova Scotia that settler fishers have had in the past 200 years. They're not having those fishing rights has meant that the economy of Indigenous communities has been paralyzed and frozen.
Can I just add on that? Because I mean, one of the challenges, fishery is a great example of where these political choices have played out. Because again, there aren't that many rich fishers either, right? Most folks work on boats. There's actually one person who owns all of the particularly offshore fishing licenses in Nova Scotia. That person, John Risley, the owner of Clearwater, has been able to not just exploit the land, the government in order to petition to get those licenses, but the workers as well, to be able to be one of the 6 billionaires that exists in Nova Scotia. To be a billionaire, which is an egregious moral predicament that we ought to be considering as well. There are a few pathways to get there. Inheritance, exploitation, or to be a monarch, which is inheritance. So again, this intersection here with the fact that, so we've got white workers who are also feeling exploited by political choices that we've made, are also then using violence against another group who has been oppressed and marginalized for hundreds of years, who are also just trying to live a quality life at the end of the day. So that one person can control all of the resources and exploit all of the wealth from that industry.
Third group is the gender question around poverty. And again, some of the very, very practical examples. Divorce is expensive, and divorce is often has a disproportionate and profound effect on women who remain the main breadwinners and the main participants in raising their children. Not all. Some of those things have changed, but many. One of the political choices that's made is the lack of energy that goes into maintenance enforcement in Nova Scotia. So there are women in this province who've been waiting for the monthly allocations to which they are entitled from the father of their children. And some of them wait years and years and years. Some of them wait months and months. Some of the money that they are entitled to has not it's not been forthcoming, and the government does not put the resources in to make demands in the enforcement of that. So that's just a direct example of how gender affects poverty and political decisions about the importance. So, you know, things get well enforced, right? Some of our tax systems are well enforced, but maintenance enforcement is not one that has the resources that women require to take care of their children. So those are some of the examples I wanted to talk about. I will come back, Alec, on specific issues of child welfare and poverty, but I think you were now going to talk about some of the
We're going to continue on this.
Political.
Yeah, we're still kind of on this notion, and I want to just look at this graph for a minute. I won't spend too long on it. I like visuals, but the black line is what represents rising inequality in Nova Scotia. This is a point that's measuring the income gap between the top 10% of earners and the bottom 10% of earners. We have this myth, certainly I believe that we've had a dialogue in Canada that represents that inequality is a growing and really problematic issue in Canada. Nova Scotia continues down the line of a narrative that we're not rich, we're a poor province, therefore how can income inequality impact us? But again, we have to reground ourselves in the reality that here in Nova Scotia, the rich are getting richer and the poor are getting poorer. That is through deliberate political choices. Now, income inequality has a number of really negative impacts throughout society, where again, rising rates of crime, rising rates of mental health issues, lower educational outcomes. In fact, when you look globally, the countries, jurisdictions that have the highest level of equality, the distance between the poorest and the richest is smallest. Those countries do better in almost every single indicator, whether it be crime, mental health, health overall, quality of life, all of those. The reality is that when we are more equal, we can engage in political life, we can engage and have our voices represented and heard, and we can continue to shift and shape policy decisions that impact us all. When we start to see power grow in the way that it has, income inequality grow in the way it has, that also is a representation of power and where it is going. Again, CCPA, Canadian Center for Policy Alternatives, also produces data at the beginning of every year. And generally, it's by noon on the first day of work that a CEO has earned the same amount that a worker will earn in their entire year. Again, we can look at the cost of living crisis that's being impacting all of us right now. The only analysis that has stood up to any kind of scrutiny at this moment in time is that the cost of living is directly related to, again, the rich exploiting the situation for their own gain. Galen Weston and our food prices are a clear example of that, where his personal profit and his personal fortune has gone up exponentially at this current time. That is because we have made political choices that have allowed that to occur. And we can make different ones and better ones at the end of the day. I'm going to do one more slide and then we will take a break. I think that that's important to do.
Some people might be waiting.
I hear. Let me do this slide and then I think we will come back after that. So when we're in this moment of inequality, rising inequality, when we also have a paradigm that it's intentionally trying to keep taxes from the rich low, as well as maintain low public spending, we start to create a narrative that there's scarcity in our society, that there's only so much to go around. There was a standing committee meeting at the Department of Community Services about a week and a half ago, in which the Deputy Minister of Community Services said they're always trying to weigh priorities out and make choices based on limited resources. And of course, the challenge with that narrative is highly problematic when we look at the bigger and global picture. Nova Scotia has an economy of $40 billion, and that's an incredible amount of resources and wealth that exists in this province. We have made decisions that have allowed 6 people to take almost half of that for themselves. Meanwhile, 100,000 people suffer in poverty. The reality, again, is that this myth of scarcity feeds into the narrative that, oh, we can't, or we can't invest in that area. Income assistance has to remain low because we can't afford it. These are some of the logics that stem from this false narrative that somehow we don't have the ability to make this change. There are countries that are poorer than us that have done more against poverty and live a higher quality of life than we have. The reality is that we can start to shift, again, the livelihoods of everyone by making political choices that align with our collective well-being. And that involves, again, looking at how our resources are allocated across the board. This is a moment that we can pause and take a 5-minute break, I think is appropriate. So we're going to come back at 5 to 3. Is that where we are?
Yeah.
Wow, we are talking. Okay, come back in 5 minutes and we'll continue with this. Back. Great. Welcome back, everyone. If we could just throw our slides back up there. So what we did want to transition to now is starting to look at how this applies, particularly to the area of child welfare, just as a tangible example. And this is one of many areas that we could look at in terms of how these decisions are being made. I am seeing that. Thank you. You're on it. Okay. My clicker doesn't seem to want to oh, there he goes. So the question, of course, that we want to try and respond to is, how do we change this growing class divide? What does that look like? What does it mean for us to be able to start to make different political decisions? Well, the reality is that in order to do that, ultimately, we need to grow a movement towards change. Movements come in many different parts and are broken down into lots of different efforts. One of the areas that our group, the Child Welfare Advocacy Coalition, has been focused on, in particular, is the provision of child welfare. And as a means to, again, connect the fight on poverty with, again, the safety of children. So in order to do that, again, we have to have a good understanding first as to what we are advocating for and the type of change that we want to see. Particularly an area like child welfare, and it's not an area of government service that gets a lot of attention. Again, healthcare, because everyone draws on healthcare, education, because almost everyone gets on education. It gets some political attention. In terms of child welfare, it does not. So one of the things that we ought to do and need to be doing is public education. That's why we're taking this opportunity to really dive into this issue with you today, is to offer this perspective on the type of change that we need to see. That is a part of type of the change we need to see to start to battle inequality and overall poverty. So we wanted to talk about the interconnectedness of child poverty and child protection. Jackie, I was going to come to you for this, if that's okay. Yeah,
Absolutely.
okay.
So just for people who haven't been through this process or worked in this system, when people's children are removed from their care, it is often because there has been a problem. Let's be clear. We're not trying to romanticize this process. People have difficulties that lead to a family breakdown or lead to circumstances in which the children are not safe and the state steps in. The question that's important is whether the goal of the process is to punish people who made mistakes, or is it to reunify families so that the issues that have caused suffering will be able to change? That's the key issue here. Is it to remove children in order to punish, or is it to create a system where the reunification of families is crucial? One of the things that we all understand, those of us who work in the system, is that while long-term foster care and adoption can be necessary and important, the reality is that most children benefit from being with their families. So when this period occurs during which the state removes children for a period of time that is fixed by legislation, what is supposed to happen during this period is the strengthening of the family so that the children can be returned. This will often mean counseling for the family, counseling for the children, trying to deal with issues of domestic violence, trying to deal with issues of substance abuse and addiction, if those are difficulties, a whole number of issues. That's what that period of time is for. What Alec and I are trying to talk about and our coalition is trying to deal with is that poverty makes every single one of the issues families are trying to address during that period of a traumatic separation of the children from their families. It makes every one of those issues harder. So let's walk through that a bit. So first of all, when the child tax benefit is removed, a family's income can drop by as much as 50%. So their capacity to hold on to whatever housing, even if it was substandard to start with, to hold on to their housing in order to have a home their child can return to, has now been rendered enormously difficult, if not impossible. So instead of creating the conditions for strengthening a family, the removal of the child tax benefit in particular can create circumstances in the middle of a housing crisis during which families actually lose their place to live. So the housing situation is desperate and increasingly desperate. And one of the reasons it's desperate is because, as Alec is explaining about poverty, is a political choice, because basically for 35 years, there's been no increase in cooperative housing. Some of us who are senior citizens will remember when there were co-op housing programs in this country. There haven't been any new ones in about 35 years. Social housing, even Tim Houston mentioned the other day that he kind of noticed that there hadn't been the construction of new public housing in Nova Scotia. He did kind of notice. I mean, he mentioned it. He mentioned it.
Yeah.
Sorry for being saucy, but he appeared to have finally mentioned it. So the housing crisis has been incredible. Violence, we are all similar as humans in terms of our strengths and weaknesses. While domestic violence crosses all income categories, its impact is way more difficult on poor families. Its impact is way more difficult on women. In order to leave, women have to find shelters, they have to find new housing, they have to find a place for their children. While domestic violence occurs at all class levels, the stressors and challenges of trying to live without enough money to feed your kids, or trying to live without work, or trying to live on completely inadequate income assistance make the struggles and the pain and the anger, not that I'm justifying domestic conflict, but it makes it harder. Everything is easier if you have the money to make choices. If you don't have the money to make choices, everything is harder. Families who are able to work and try to continue working during the child welfare process are challenged because they may have to take time off work to go for counseling, to go and visit their children, to try to meet all of the requirements. Even if the requirements are legitimate requirements, it is extremely hard to hold on to a job and be able to tell your boss you have to go for a 2-hour meeting with your children this afternoon. The privacy of the family becomes very difficult to hold on to because there are so many expectations, not illegitimate expectations, but so many challenges that if you're working at Sobeys is something your boss is not likely to be compassionate toward. Telephones. We live in an era where the existence of a cell phone and immediate contact for families is crucial. And yet, as we know in Canada, we have the highest rates of cell phone costs in the country. Those cell phone costs are hard enough for us to, I find it annoying and difficult to keep trying to renegotiate my cell phone and internet costs. But low-income people have no ability to manage that with any flexibility. So during Zoom, during the entire, I call it during Zoom, what I mean is during COVID, when a lot of arrangements had to be made online, low-income families are trying to pay for a much cheaper internet option, one which has not as good quality of service, harder for people to access Zoom, harder for people to maintain their phone and internet connections. Huge problem. Transportation, low-income families. I would say over 75% of the people I work with who are child protection clients, over 75% are reliant on bus and public transportation. Bus and public transportation are wonderful, except they are not timely to people trying to juggle work, court hearings, meetings with their therapists, meetings with their social workers. And remember, because of gentrification and the impact of housing in Halifax, means they are often in housing locations and communities, if they're lucky enough to have housing, which are far away from the resources that they are trying to get access to.
Well, and again, that doesn't even speak to the complexity of rural communities
Exactly.
and transportation.
Another layer of the intersection of poverty and child protection that's enormous. You're absolutely right, Alec. And the last thing I would have mentioned is this question of medicalization. So while there are mental health problems that people in the child protection system are experiencing, the reality is that many of the things that they are going through are the result of suffering and not having enough resources, not the result of mental health problems. But the services that are offered are counseling to deal with their stress, when often what families could use is some money to deal with their stress. And this brings me to my last point, which is the business of poverty. And one of the I am in the poverty business. Alec is in the poverty business. We are people who are paid to try to support the issues of poverty. I am paid to do counseling with people in the child protection system. Lawyers are paid to defend families in the child protection system. The cost of the services that are paid to us as professionals are extraordinarily disproportionate to the amount of money that our very clients are living on. So the lawyers are making a reasonable professional income, the social workers and therapists are making a reasonable professional income, but that's for working people who aren't even close to a livable income. I'll stop there.
Okay. So I just want to layer on top of that a little bit, just how poor some of our public policy decisions are and how cruel they are as well. Jackie's laid out that intersection of poverty and child welfare and how it impacts one another. But what we did in 2017, which we talked briefly about at the beginning, is we changed the philosophy of children and family services. Again, and I'm not going to sit here and claim that we've ever gotten child welfare services right. That would be disingenuous and not true. But what we've done is continually pivot down a trend to make child welfare more about surveillance and punishment than about working towards the well-being of families. This is particularly true when you look at the changes that were made by the last provincial government to the Children and Family Services Act. They did so for political reasons, in my mind. There again was a minister who was looking to make a name for themselves. That was certainly a piece of it. As Jackie mentioned, they did so without consultation. And honestly, I shake my head. There are internal documents that show that they hired, multi-million-dollar consultants to help them develop this act and this strategy. And the consultants somehow concluded that making these changes would be cost neutral to the government, that somehow they would not spend any more money if they made these changes. Well, one, we can talk about the use of consultants in another presentation altogether, but it just shows that, again, they had no sense of how the system operates and what it looks like. Some of the more prolific changes was removing some of the areas where you had to have demonstrable proof that somebody was harmed to moving to probability of harm. What that did was lower the threshold so that intervention is happening and intrusion is happening far more frequently, far more often, and without the resources to do it in an effective way. So instead, if we were to have services aligned to doing this earlier intervention, what it could look like is, somebody saying, oh, a kid came to school today without a winter jacket on. And we had resources that went around to figure out, why does that kid not have a winter jacket in the middle of winter? Instead, what we have is a system that when somebody says, oh, that child didn't have a winter jacket on, and then we have a system that goes to the parents and says, why didn't you give this kid a winter jacket? It's cold outside. What, you can't afford it or something? Why? What kind of food do you have in the fridge? Oh, junk food? I'm going to judge you for that and hold you accountable for that. And that is the way that our system is continually shaped. And that, again, is along the lines of how we punish and specifically view poor people and the poor in our province. So Jackie's touched a little bit on this. Did you want to go further into this, Jackie?
No. Tried to elaborate very specifically on this, on the colonization and racism issues specifically.
Yeah. And then we've also talked about the impact on mental health. And I mean, here's the other problem. Jackie talked about the medicalization of services. This is a challenge we're having in healthcare across the board right now, is that particularly mental health, your mental health is more shaped by the economic, social, and political context of your life than it is about the biochemistry that's happening in your brain. Similarly, though, we've built systems that are focused on the biochemistry in your brain more often. And I'm not saying that that's not effective. For many people, that is still an important piece of the system. But we've negated all of the conversation around the political, social, and economic factors that contribute to mental health. So again, and I'll pick on the Premier, the words come out of his mouth very easily, the social determinants of health. We in this environment have done absolutely nothing to address those. And that just leads to further harm and further impact. And as Jackie mentioned as well, the impact on family reunification. And of course, this creates really, honestly, an ineffective system. Our partners at the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives 2 years ago produced a report that demonstrated that the cost of poverty to Nova Scotia is $2 billion a year. That's in lost productivity and excessive government services. So those excessive government services that are being named there are the business of poverty. The police officers, the lawyers, the social workers, the mental health therapists, all of these folks, as Jackie had mentioned, when honestly, many of those resources would be much more effectively. And here's a core government word that we miss out on when we talk about poverty: efficiently. If we were actually to spend on things like core housing, on income supports, on being able to provide universal in-community mental health care, as well as family support programs that are universal, that anyone can walk in and receive that support, which is needed in parenting at all times, not just if you're involved in the child welfare system.
Alec, can I add one more thing? I don't know if you had concluded yet before we go to questions, but I wanted to make one more plug, and this is a personal plug. I'm not representing the Child Welfare Advocacy Coalition here, or the College of Social Workers, but one of the things that we like to think is politics as a small p. And all politics and all political parties are actually not the same. And nonprofits cannot speak because they have government funding. Child protection clients cannot speak because they're afraid of the state. Poor people are frightened of speaking for a myriad of reasons, including that if they complain about their housing situation. And civil servants actually can't speak. So, sorry, my plea to you is, if you are in scans and participating in this work and you're retired, you can speak. And you can speak politically. You don't have to speak in this kind of nuanced way that says, oh, well, you know, political parties, they're all the same, doesn't matter, they all have the same policies. No, in fact, all political parties do not have the same policies. And so it behooves all of us to pay attention at election and other times as to what kind of specific policies are intended and geared toward creating some justice, racial justice, and justice with regard to poverty. And those of us in this group who are retired have an awful lot of power in a province where not a lot of people do. Just wanted to add.
Yeah, no, I think that's really important. I think that one of the areas where we often are perhaps missing the power that we do hold and have is we are privileged enough to live in a democracy, however challenging it may be. At the end of the day, again, although it appears like all the elected officials that we are working for them, the reverse is actually true. Their primary mandate is to the people who have elected them, and not just the people that voted for them, everyone who's in their riding in their constituency. There's a lot of power in that. Often it's power that we aren't really tapping into or aware of. Some of the times that's because, you know, as Canadians and Nova Scotians, we are polite to a point of being ineffective. Again, it's important to be polite. It's important to build relationships. But here's what I mean by that, is that we may write a politician or a decision maker with an issue that's on our minds. And more than often than not, and I'd love to see a show of hands of how many have done that, you might start the email with, I know you're a very busy person, but the reality is that it doesn't matter if they're busy or not. They have the obligation and responsibility to make time for you, their constituents, the people that they serve. So again, reaching out and framing with, this is an important issue that I need you to make time for, is still equally polite, but also doesn't negate the, like when you say, oh, you're probably very busy, you're giving people an out to not deal with these issues. So again, that political work, and Jackie's right, this group has a tremendous amount of ability, capacity, and power to be able to reach out, set up those meetings, have those conversations, demand better. Ultimately, particularly this government, but most governments are responsive to the public pulse, what's happening out there. You know, a collective outrage or outrise towards a different outcome really changes government policy and the trajectory of it. We've seen that a number of times in our history. I mean, we can look at movements like Idle No More and even the Black Lives Movement coming out of George Floyd, which in a short time have moved a number of issues in a particular direction. And that's ultimately, again, the activists and the Indigenous and Black communities have been able to mobilize, but white people have also been able to ally with that call and that voice and start to push for really important change. So this brings us to our specific calls to action for you that we would invite you to take on. And this is where we can see hope in what can be achieved. I think it's great that we're hearing the Premier and the Minister start to talk about public social housing. As Jackie alluded to, the reason why we are in the housing crisis that we are in was because federally, before our current federal government, the last government to spend money on housing was Brian Mulroney 30 years ago. Again, this was done along this neoliberal ideology agenda, but you know, some of the rationale for it was that housing is a provincial issue. Provinces should spend money on housing, to which the provinces did not. So we have not seen new public housing added in almost 30 years. There's at least a need of 33,000 new units at this moment in time. And again, I think there was a question already that alluded to the high-rise buildings that are being built. Again, I took a walk up Citadel Hill the other day and did a panoramic scan. I think I counted 20 different cranes. Not one of those cranes is building an affordable unit at all. Our premier strategy, and he stood up in the legislature and said this, is that we just need housing. If we build housing, then affordable housing will fall out of that. He has basically appropriated trickle-down economics to housing, somehow believing that affordable housing will materialize itself. That is not the reality in any way. You're not going to see how rentals radically drop because there's more housing. The only way to do that is by the building of public, nonprofit, and cooperative housing. That's the only thing that has ever made housing affordable, and it is the only evidence-based tool we have to get where we arrive. So writing to your MLA, scheduling a meeting, going in and saying this is what we need now is going to be really important, particularly as we start to head into the budget cycle. The next one Jackie's talked about as well. This one really ought to be a no-brainer. It is such low-hanging fruit. And the fact that Jackie and I and our groups have been fighting for this for 6 years really is still mind-blowing, but we are seeing progress. So as Jackie alluded to, when a child is brought into care, the Canada Child Tax Benefit is removed from that family, putting that family in real jeopardy. There are other provinces that have responded and acted in different ways. And the reality is that the province does not need to be collecting that money, that ought to remain with the families so that they can reunify. We have heard that there may be some policy coming out on this. So now is the time to certainly go to your MLA and push for it. So one of the other areas that's really crucial and really can't be lost, and I made this at the beginning, is our dismal record on income assistance. And Nova Scotia does have the lowest income assistance rates in the country. But more importantly than that is the reason they're low is because we haven't done a basic principle of economics, which would be to tie that benefit to the cost of living or inflation. One of the reasons that when we look at groups, particularly seniors, don't have the same level of poverty as perhaps other groups is because the federal programs that were put in place to support seniors are all indexed to inflation. So OAS, GIC, even CPP, as the cost of living goes up, those benefits are adjusted. With income assistance, that has not happened. It's not happened in 30 years. It's at the benevolence of a government to say, oh, maybe this year we can up it a little bit. The deep level of poverty we have cannot be resolved unless we are looking at income supports meaningfully and robustly to get us where we need to go. I can give you the stat and reminding folks that many people are $10,000 a year short from the poverty line. I don't know about your budget, but that would be $10,000 less would really impact how I live my life for sure. And then, of course, the raising of the minimum wage, which honestly, government, it's revenue neutral for government. They don't pay out the minimum wage. It's important to note that minimum wage was never designed on anything. When minimum wage was legislated, it was legislated at $1 for no rhyme or reason. Again, it's gone up, but again, it's gone up for no rhyme or reason. What are we basing it on? What does it actually represent? What is it meant to be? Now, there was a point of time where a minimum wage did represent a living wage. That time has come and gone. We are far from it at this point in time. We're in an environment now where minimum wage has not kept up with the price of living or inflation, and that activists have been calling for a $15 minimum wage for about 10 years now. That $15 minimum wage is also not effective or efficient at this moment. We are well beyond that. We will have a $15 minimum wage. We'll probably get it in the fall, and it's not going to do a whole lot at this point in time because we've missed that opportunity. So the ask has to be, get us to $15 and then get us a plan to get to a living wage. A living wage in Halifax right now is about $23 an hour. That's also calculated by our friends at the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives. And it is a conservative estimate. You're not living a high life on $23 an hour. That is the basic cost to meet your needs, as well as participate in community, which is vitally important, not just to our politics, but to our mental health and to our own well-being. And so those are the asks we have for you. Jackie, do you want to?
No, I just want to say, go and ask for it right away tomorrow, please.
We are happy to end there for our presentation, and we are delighted to answer any questions you might have or to keep the conversation going.
Thank you. That has been so informative. I appreciate the time and effort that you have taken. You've given us this broad perspective and this personal perspective. And I would just ask everyone to not go and ask for 22 minutes while we finish the questions that we have. And then we'll go and ask. We do have some questions. I think you've touched on some of them, but I will run through them and you can let me know what you'd like to say in response. And I'm going to leave it up to the two of you that for the most part, the questions are not directed at either one of you. So you may choose to answer individually or have something each to say. We will try to, it's about 3:30, so we'll try to wrap up for 4, and I think we should be able to do that. But you've got some fabulous questions. Andrea is wondering if you could talk about the way means testing for subsidies can be a nasty process, how it is a barrier to uptake in that it is demoralizing.
Right there, yeah. Yeah, I mean, means testing first showed its ugly head when we first started to generate charity and welfare programs. I mean, back in the 1920s, there was welfare workers that would go out with measuring tapes to measure your waist to see if you were actually going hungry. Well, we have evolved. Those means testings are still in place in many ways where you have to prove that you, and it's not just in the delivery of welfare, it's in the delivery of things like health too, where you have to be able to prove that you are poor enough, desperate enough, have no other resources, or sick enough before the systems start to check in. Again, it leads to a very stigmatizing system. It leads to a very ineffective and inefficient system. For instance, things like mental health are progressive, where the longer we leave them, the worse they get for folks. Whereas if we're addressing them earlier on, like most things, we can solve the problem much easier. So when we look at means testing, we can look at income assistance as an example, right? And now we have made some policy reforms in this area, but not many. Before you qualify for income assistance, you have to demonstrate that you have spent all of your savings, that any resources you might have, including or an asset, including a car or something along those lines, that you've worked to build assets on that. Before you're given a break and a chance. And then even on top of that, you know, there was a period of time where you weren't even able, again, the plight for many folks is it's if you are really living in that deep poverty, you know, getting from deep poverty to a job that pays living wage isn't something that happens overnight. Oftentimes you have to heal yourself. There are skills that you need to work on. You then need an employer to give you a chance. Most employers, particularly if you're working retail or frontline in some way, aren't hiring you full-time. If they hire you full-time, then they have to pay you benefits, which costs them more money. So there's a ton of precariousness that goes into that. So for a period of time, you weren't even able to collect a wage without them clawing that directly back from income assistance. We've luckily changed that policy slightly. But all that to say is that what I advocate for, with the organization that I advocate for, is that we need in social services universality. Similar to how we frame healthcare in Canada, and I say frame it because it's not always perfect, in that you ought to be able to walk into your doctor's office, get the services that you need without having to pull out proof that you need those services or a credit card or show them that you've spent all of your resources. In social services, that is still very much the case, where you need to demonstrate that you are this desperate before they will apply services.
All I would add to that question is probably what you've already said. We really need to know what humiliation feels like. And humiliation is when you have to beg for basic rights. That's humiliation.
Thank you. We have a question specific to the lobster fishery. So John says, I believe that the lobster fishery is the largest in Nova Scotia and licenses are restricted to actual fishers. Consolidation of licenses has been attempted, but I believe is prevented by law. With the number of licenses fixed to assure working wages for license holders, the distribution of licenses to Aboriginal fishers is resisted in part by other white fishers and by which to preserve the resource. Federal government has purchased licenses from white fishers to provide to Aboriginal fishers. Still a work in progress, and wondering if you have a comment on that situation or that process.
I had raised the fisheries question, and so I'm going to say with a great deal of humility that it is enormously complicated. I have heard very many different positions articulated, basically by listening to CBC and other programs to try to explain the complexity of the fishery. I don't think I can add anything to the questions and comments, except that consultation is the key issue, and that on a provincial level, Mi'kmaq communities are actually putting forward proposals on these questions, and it is their proposals that I would trust. And the reason it's their proposals I would trust is because I have not seen evidence. I think none of our communities are perfect, but I've seen no evidence that what Mi'kmaq fishers are trying to do is to put white fishers out of business. And I know that there is a lot of talk and a lot of complexity around the issue of the environment and depleting the fishery, et cetera, et cetera. Those are not unimportant questions, but I don't think that justice and the environment should be put in contradiction to each other, nor do I think, though this may be naive on my part, but I do not believe that the rights of settler fishers are being stolen from Mi'kmaq fishers by their trying to get their rights. But that's a belief and an opinion, and I don't have detail to add to that.
The only thing I would add is, yeah, I mean, that's the strategy that the federal government is trying to play out as a bit of a peacemaker. I don't think it gets at the fundamental issues in any way. And one, we have to remember that we are on Indigenous land that is stated in, it was never conceded, it was never written over, it is not in any way legally white settler land. And so we have to find a way to live in solidarity in the context where we are right now. And part of that is recognizing that the fisheries is a colonial construct based on, again, ideas of scarcity and power. And so again, buying fishing license from people who have hoarded them, John Risley being one, and giving them to Indigenous fishers is, not necessarily getting at the point that the control of the resources, the control of the land, is and ought to be with the Mi'kmaq people of this province. And that in order for us to develop resources, shouldn't be us saying to the Mi'kmaq people, this is how you're going to develop resources. It's in fact the other way around. These are your resources, never legally or in any way given to settlers, that we can share. How do you best suggest that we share that? That's part of the land back movement that Jackie was talking about at the beginning of this conversation, that we ought to be really considering as a legitimate political force for reconciliation. And again, that land back movement isn't like us saying, here's my house, Indigenous people. It's about recognizing fundamentally that the land, the rights to that land and the stewardship of that land belongs to the Mi'kmaq people, and that we ought to be going through them to be able to determine the best way to utilize that land, not the other way around.
We have a question that you have certainly touched on. Kathy is wondering if you can comment on guaranteed basic income.
Guaranteed basic income is a very popular idea, or I shouldn't say very popular, gaining popularity. It certainly has, I mean, at the root of it is what we've been arguing for and advocating for, is that when folks are given or receive as a benefit of citizenship, of entitlement, a quality of income, that their lives will radically improve. The question is, and the question that's debated is that, is a basic income the best way to get there? I'm not going to go into that debate at this moment in time. I think principally, you know, the end goal is the same, is that income should be universal, given at an adequate rate so that people can live a quality life.
Probably the best income improvement program in the history since the beginning of capitalism is unionization. So that's a pretty straightforward one.
We have a comment from Margot that says, very smart of you to issue a call to action to participants. But Margot also suggests that people should write to both MPs and MLAs, as some of the solutions are federal.
I'd like to comment on that briefly, because I think you're absolutely right. In general, some of the specificity that we've called for, though, the provincial government has been regularly arguing that the child tax benefit conflict is a federal issue. We do not agree that it's a federal issue. It is a federal law. It is a federal program. But the provinces are the ones who control in a child welfare matter whether the child tax, whether they interpret the law as meaning they should be taking away the money from the family. It's a very literal interpretation. There are lawyers that we work with, thank God, who are very well informed on this issue. But and I'm not disagreeing that advocating with the federal government is important, but specifically on the question of the child tax benefit, we believe at this point that this is a provincial government. With regard to housing, social housing, absolutely making demands to the federal government. Absolutely. Minimum wage, provincial territory.
That's right. I would say that advocacy to the federal government is absolutely important. Housing, as Jackie said, can be one of them, but really where the federal government plays the biggest role in changing these systems is in our taxation system. They have the ability to much more effectively and efficiently make a real progressive tax system that effectively, taxes billionaires out of existence, which is what I believe ought to be happening at this very moment.
Yeah, I think we could make some buttons.
Right.
Tax billionaires out of existence.
That's right. And federal transfers, which come directly from their ability to raise revenue. So that is the effectiveness of the federal government.
We have several thank yous for a thoughtful and thought-provoking discussion, but we have one last question. Marlene notes that the Nova Scotia government has not changed income tax brackets for years to account for the rise of the cost of living. I'm just wondering if you have thoughts on that.
A lot of thoughts on that. So yeah, we are one of the only provinces that doesn't index our tax brackets. So for instance, I was looking the other day, $150,000 is the highest tax bracket at this point in time. Incomes have grown, like we are getting up to that. $150,000 isn't really that much money anymore for someone. And there are a lot of tax brackets that we can add to that on top of that that are encapsulate. But on the other end of that, when we look at income supports programs or even tax rebate programs, again, they've been affected by the fact that the bar is moved in terms of where quality of living is, but when you start to receive benefits has not moved at all. So like many provinces index both their tax brackets as well as their benefits. It's a very, it's a basic economic policy that I don't know why. Well, I know why,
Yeah.
but
I think we do know why.
but it's one of those political choices that we've made, is that again, it allows the rich to benefit and allows the poor to pay for the benefits of the rich.
So the callback shout out is please volunteer for the North American Indigenous Games if you have a chance. It's a week this summer. Website's right there. Please consider looking into the land back movement so that our land acknowledgements have substance and meaning. Please write to the provincial government with regarding the child tax benefit. Please demand social housing from the federal government and federal government policies. Please demand an increase in the minimum wage more than $15 an hour. And what was our fourth one?
Income assistance.
And please, please demand that income assistance be indexed. Thank you
And you
all.
did that wonderfully. I appreciate that. But we've got now 3 follow-up questions for you. So close.
Oh.
We've got 2 that are dealing with fisheries questions and 1 that's about the guaranteed annual income. And Janet is just wondering about the Dauphin experience. Am I pronouncing that correctly? And not sure. DAUPHIN, and not sure if that has any specific meaning. No.
Oh, yeah, thank you for that reference. Somebody referenced, and then it made sense to me. So that's a pilot study done in Manitoba around basic income,
Okay.
which again demonstrated what we've been saying, is that when folks have a decent quality of income, their lives substantially improve.
Kidding.
Yeah. There's been some this is the thing with governments and pilots, is that there is a body of research that's hundreds of thousands of pages long that'll show that income impacts quality of life. We don't need to really pilot or study anymore.
Well, because every single one of us knows that for ourselves.
Right. Yes. So again, those studies are important in terms of being able to point to that, the impacts. But again, they're at this point in time, we really don't need more study on that issue. We just need, again, us to forcibly demand for what is logical and just, which is that people need to have a basic quality of income to be able to live a good and fulsome life.
Stella has a bit of a follow-up to the fishery discussion. She's wondering, what does it mean that, as I understand it, many of the white fishers in Southwest Nova are Acadians who resettled there after they were expelled by the British in 1755?
I mean, I'm not sure what she's referring to, but I think that Nova Scotian history has no absence of oppression. So oppression has definitely occurred against the Acadian communities, African Nova Scotian community, racialized immigrants, colonization of Mi'kmaq people. I think, and I'm not going to introduce this with but, I think it's about and, the justice for the historical wrongs toward the Acadian people should not be on the backs of Indigenous people. We cannot put the complexity of oppressions as something to be pitted in various groups, which is not what I'm saying you're suggesting. I'm simply saying that Acadians have been treated horribly in the history of this province by the same people who colonized Indigenous land. Reconciliation, however, will not happen until we actually address the original sins in the United States of enslavement in Canada, and colonization. They are just key basic questions.
So I just want to add a little bit onto that as well, as it's not the same context, and I don't want to, again, like Jackie, take away from the layers of oppression that have happened in Nova Scotia. I say it's not the same context ultimately because as settlers, we signed treaties with Indigenous people. A treaty is only something that happens from nation to nation. We don't sign treaties between provinces. We don't sign treaties between services. A treaty is something that happens between a sovereign state, a sovereign nation, and another sovereign nation. When we talk about reconciliation at its core is a nation to nation relationship. It's not the same context that we're talking about in that we are talking about dealing with the fundamental rights and jurisdiction of a nation that we happen to have landed on and then built our own set of rules and policies void of the nations that were here before
That's
us. Reconciliation is about moving back, I don't know that we were ever there, moving to a place where these conversations are done from the basis of mutual respect and a nation to nation conversation.
Well, we have one follow-up question and our last question from Stella, and it's linked to that. Just wondering what the implications might be that a Mi'kmaq group has bought into Clearwater, founded by John Risley, who has come up in the discussion today.
Yeah, we see this all the time, where we, see groups that have been oppressed work through the systems and structures to enrich and empower their communities. Do I think it will be a winning strategy in the end? I think as long as we have a few people controlling all of the resources, that's problematic. But I think time will tell. In terms of if that's an effective strategy or not towards reconciliation and towards, again, a livelihood fishery.
And I think it's also really important for us to acknowledge that that in the struggle to improve the circumstances and conditions of deeply oppressed people whose land and resources has been stolen, there are going to be political positions that settler populations don't agree with. And as Alex said very eloquently, it is the right of the Mi'kmaq to negotiate and organize how they choose. There will be disagreements with that, but the nation-to-nation question is crucial in making it clear that if Mi'kmaq people in Nova Scotia themselves choose, or their institutions choose, to participate in the capitalist system, we've kind of been benefiting from that for a couple hundred years. So maybe that isn't the first, that's not the first criticism that we should throw.
Thank you. And that does bring us to the end of the presentation for today. Thank you, Jackie and Alec. You've put tremendous thought and effort into this, and it's reflected in the fact that our audience has actually grown since we started. So people are obviously pulling others in to listen to the discussion. I don't know that that's happened before. I think one of the things that was particularly appreciated was the balance of data with personal experience, as well as the call to action. So knowing that there is something that we can do and something that we should do. So thank you for including that in your talk and for being with us today. As I wrap up, I do want to thank our tech team, who I don't think they sleep, for which we are eternally grateful. But Bill Lee and Bob Russell, we appreciate everything that you've done, including getting me in at the last moment magically somehow. So thank you. And just a reminder that we have another talk coming up, intriguingly, about 4 overlooked women. So we are hoping that you will join us on February 13th. That's a Monday. That's my phone. There we go. February 13th, Monday at 2 o'clock for that presentation. We'll also remind you that many of the people here today are members of SCANS. Some of you are not. You may be new to us. You may be enjoying the public lectures, but we encourage you to join us. And we have a wonderful roster of courses in addition to presentations. So thank you all for being here today. And ideally, we will see you on the 13th of February. Thank you, Jackie and Alec. Goodbye.
Thanks for having us.
Bye now.